Chapter 6.5. To deny the importance of nurturing, the social intelligence hypothesis was invented. Since humans are primates, the obvious area of research that has the most potential to shed light on our origins is the field of primatology. But it is in this most enlightening of fields that some of the most dishonest thinking about the origins of our species' moral sense has been taking place. Despite John Fiske having presented the nurturing explanation for our moral nature way back in 1874, the great majority of primatologists have been so fearful of the truth of nurturing that they have persevered along the habituated path of denial, serving up completely dishonest interpretations of primate behaviour. This denial is particularly palpable if we compare their dishonest studies with the work of the rare few honest primatologists who have dared to recognise the role that nurturing plays in primate society. For instance, the obviousness, if you're not practicing denial, of the nurturing love indoctrination process and how extremely confronting a truth it is apparent in Dian Fossey's study of gorillas. As described in paragraphs 446 to 448, Fossey was an extraordinarily strong-willed woman for whom the universal practice of denial in mechanistic science held no sway. Few, if any, however, have been able to cope with the honesty of her studies, and, as a result, she has been misrepresented as merely a fanatical gorilla conservationist, such as in the 1988 film of her life, Gorillas in the Mist. A read, however, of her wonderfully insightful treatise on gorilla behaviour, the 1983 book Gorillas in the Mist, upon which the film was unfaithfully based, shows just how courageous a scientist Fossey was. She watched the lives of troops of gorillas over many generations and gave a denial-free, honest account of what she saw, which was the whole love indoctrination process at work. Fearlessly, she wrote that, like human mothers, gorilla mothers show a great variation in the treatment of their offspring. Flossie was very casual in the handling, grooming and support of both of her infants, whereas Old Goat was an exemplary parent. Old Goat's offspring, the exemplary parented Tiger, was taking his place in Group 4's growing cohesiveness. By the age of 5, Tiger was surrounded by playmates his own age, a loving mother, and a protective group leader. He was a contented and well-adjusted individual whose zest for living was almost contagious for the other animals of his group. However, the immigrant menace, Beats Me, developed an unruly desire to dominate. I found myself strongly disliking Beats Me as I watched his discord destroy the group's cohesiveness. On reading this, one can appreciate why the whole nurturing love indoctrination process has been so determinately denied. Old Goat was an exemplary parent who created a well-adjusted offspring with a wonderful zest for living, while the menacing, unruly, discord-creating, cohesiveness-destroying, non-loving, and by inference unloved Beats Me was dislikable. The implication for humans being that if you don't give your child love, you're a bad person, and, as has been emphasized, humans would rather admit to being an axe murderer than being a bad father or mother. In his 1989 book, Peacemaking Among Primates, the primatologist Frans de Waal describes a meeting that was held between an unnamed psychiatrist and the aforementioned Harry F. Harlow, a psychologist who, in the 1950s, studied the extremely damaging effect isolation and touch deprivation had on rhesus monkey infants. Their discussion reveals just how unbearable and confronting both the concept and the importance of nurturing love has been for those studying primates, and just how fearless Fossey was, by comparison, in her honesty. For some scientists it was hard to accept that monkeys may have feelings. In the 1979 book The Human Model, authors Harry F. Harlow and Clara E. Mears described the following strained meeting. Harlow used the term love, at which the psychiatrist present countered with the word proximity. Harlow then shifted to the word affection, with the psychiatrist again countering with proximity. Harlow started to simmer, but relented when he realised that the closest the psychiatrist had probably ever come to love was proximity. Yes, despite our species' instinctive need to give and receive love, humans' present human condition afflicted, unloved and unloving lives, where the closest the immensely upset human race has probably ever come to love is proximity, has meant that our ability to even acknowledge the existence of unconditional selflessness or love, which is what nurturing essentially is, and the ramifications of not receiving it, has been nigh impossible. Since this is the end play time predicted in the Bible, when the love of most will grow cold, it is no wonder mechanistic science practices the extreme dishonesty that Allott described in his aforementioned paper, when he reported that love has been described as a taboo subject, not serious, not appropriate for scientific study. This despite, as Montague acknowledged, love being one of the most frequently used words in our vocabulary. It follows then that the bonobos, whose extraordinarily maternal, nurturing, loving treatment of their infants and the resulting remarkable, integrative, loving behaviour they exhibit as adults was described at length in Chapter 5, have been extremely exposing, confronting and condemning of the unloved and unloving human race. As I mentioned in paragraph 416, the biologist, psychologist and bonobo authority Sue Savage-Rumbaugh has bravely admitted that nurturing is the focus of bonobo society. Like Fossey, she has let the truth out of the bag that the cooperative behaviour of bonobos is a product of the infant-focused nurturing of love, love indoctrination process. Writing with the assistance of her co-author, the writer Roger Lewin, that bonobo life is centred around the offspring. Unlike what happens among common chimps, all members of the bonobo social group help with infant care and share food with infants. If you are a bonobo infant, you can do no wrong. Bonobo females and their infants form the core of the group. But, also like Fossey, Savage-Rumbaugh's honesty appears to have made her the target of the human condition avoiding, nurturing denying, mechanistic scientific establishment, because in 2012 a campaign was launched to discredit and marginalise her groundbreaking work with bonobos. I've been told by a scientist whom I respect and who knows Savage-Rumbaugh personally that she has become somewhat erratic, but if that is the case, I strongly suspect the genesis of such instability would be years of unfair and undermining criticism from the mechanistic establishment. So the question now is, how was denial of the obvious role nurturing plays in the lives of more developed or integrated or social mammals achieved, especially of primates, and most especially bonobos, which the studies of Fossey and Savage-Rumbaugh bear witness to, and which provide such powerful evidence of how we acquired our cooperative, unconditionally selfless moral instincts. Clearly, such a denial wasn't going to be easy, but looking an obvious truth in the face and finding a way to deny it, such as finding a way to deny the extremely obvious truths of integrative meaning and of our corrupted human condition, is something we humans are masters at. So yes, how did mechanistic science manage to look the obvious truth of the importance of nurturing in the face and deny it? There have been two ways. The first was to portray maternalism as nothing more than a mother providing her dependent offspring with food and protection. As was explained in Chapter 5.4, the truth is that mothers' maternal instincts to nourish and protect their offspring did provide the base from which the love indoctrination process was able to develop. However, in love indoctrination, maternalism became about much more than a mother looking after her infant. It became a case of actively loving that infant. Again, it is not insignificant that we speak of motherly love, not motherly protection. The problem, however, with this method of denying the nurturing, loving significance of maternalism is that in the case of the extremely exposing of the truth, infant-focused, maternal bonobo society, their environment has historically been food-rich and competitor and predator-free. So it doesn't make sense to argue that their exceptionally maternal behaviour has been driven by the need to either source food or provide protection. The second method used to deny the significance of nurturing in bonobo life, and by inference its significance in the lives of our ape ancestors, is the one Richard Leakey referred to in his and Roger Lewin's 1977 book Origins, that the extended infancies in primates is due to the infant's need for prolonged learning about their environment. A more complete rendition of this alleged explanation for the need for the nurturing that we see in the society of more developed mammals, particularly in bonobos and humans, is that, to quote Encyclopaedia Britannica, the more sophisticated species also exhibit longer infant and juvenile stages, which are probably related to the time required for their more advanced mental development and their integration into complex social systems. As will be explained at some length in Chapter 7.3, in paragraph 660-669, this so-called social intelligence hypothesis, sometimes referred to as the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis, and its more sophisticated version, the ecological dominance social competition model, essentially maintain that the long mother-infant association is needed to ensure the infant learns the skills necessary to manage complex social situations, and that it was this need that also led to more advanced mental development, ultimately the fully conscious, intelligent mind in humans. As will be described in Chapter 7.3, when the truthful explanation of the origins of consciousness is presented, even human condition avoiding mechanistic scientists have raised serious concerns over the viability of both the social or Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis, SMIH, and the ecological dominant social competition, EDSC, model. But from the human condition confronting truthful view of biology, some very obvious flaws with both models can be pointed out immediately, particularly in regard to their core argument that our fully conscious intelligent mind emerged as a result of having to learn to manage complex social situations, a process that supposedly required and explained the long infancy. Social problem solving is, of course, an obvious benefit of being conscious, but all activities that animals have to manage would benefit enormously from conscious intelligence, from the ability to reason how cause and effect are related, to understand change, to make sense of experience, to be insightful. So it is completely illogical to suggest that it wasn't until the need arose to manage complex social situations that consciousness developed. No. Any sensible analysis of how and when consciousness emerged must be based on the question, what has prevented its development in other animals? A lack of social situations doesn't explain why the fully conscious mind hasn't appeared in non-human species, because there was ample need for a conscious mind prior to the appearance of complex social situations. No, the only accountable explanation for the emergence of the fully conscious mind in humans, and for what is blocking its emergence in other species, is the nurturing love indoctrination explanation, which, to recap very briefly, states that the nurturing of selflessness liberated the fully conscious, intelligent mind from the block that exists in non-human species minds against thinking selflessly, and thus truthfully, and thus effectively. Again, this will all be fully explained in Chapter 7.3. Another obvious flaw with both the SMIH and the EDSC model is that if it wasn't for the psychologically upset state of the human condition, there would be no need to learn and become intelligent enough to master the art of managing complex social systems. Through the process of love indoctrination, we humans became so instinctively integrated that there was no disharmony or conflict or discord or complexity to have to manage. Prior to the emergence of the human condition some 2 million years ago, our species lived instinctively as one organism. What did the Greek poet Hesiod say? Like gods they lived, with calm untroubled mind, free from the toils and anguish of our kind. They with abundant goods, midst quiet lands, all willing, shared the gathering of their hands. As Plato wrote, this was a time most blessed, celebrated by us in our state of innocence, before we had any experience of evils to come, when we were admitted to the sight of apparitions innocent and simple and calm and happy, and not yet enshrined in that living tomb which we carry about, now that we are imprisoned. The time when we lived a blessed and spontaneous life, where neither was there any violence or devouring of one another, or war or quarrel among them. In those days there were no forms of government or separate possession of women and children, for all men rose again from the earth, having no memory of the past. We lived in a pre-conscious state, obedient to our loving instincts. And the earth gave them fruits in abundance, which grew on trees and shrubs unbidden, and were not planted by the hand of man. And they dwelt naked and mostly in the open air, for the temperature of their seasons was mild, and they had no beds but lay on soft couches of grass, which grew plentifully out of the earth. The pre-human condition afflicted integrated, cooperative, sharing, loving, social, calm and happy, blessed and spontaneous, species individual state, such as that which largely exists in bonobo society today, simply wasn't a situation that called for infants to be skilled in social management techniques. As Plato said, there was no quarrelling and no need for forms of government. And the even more blatant flaw with the two arguments that have been used to dismiss the important role nurturing played in the lives of our forebears, and continues to play in the development or integration or socialisation of other mammals, especially other primates, and most especially bonobos, is that they suggest nurturing is nothing more than a mother providing her dependent infant with food and protection, and that the long mother-infant association is needed only to allow the time to impart social skills. But, as stated earlier, humans can't have developed such powerful instincts to nurture our offspring with love, or such powerful expectations of receiving unconditional love as children, if nurturing hadn't played a fundamental role in the history of our species' development. As I said, such instincts and expectations do not appear out of thin air. The response to this statement, however, from advocates of the SMIH and the EDSC model would be that mothers simply don't have powerful instincts to nurture their offspring with love, and children simply don't have expectations of being loved. Rather, mothers have powerful instincts to teach their offspring how to manage integration into complex social systems, and children have instinctual expectations of being taught such skills. In other words, it is not a case of instincts to love and be loved coming out of thin air, but a case of such instincts never existing in the first place. But that is absurd. Indeed, it is offensively dishonest, because everyone does intuitively know that what Schreiner and Montague wrote about infants' need for love is true. Yes, what an infant needs from its parents, and from its mother in particular, is unconditional love, not training in the management of complex social situations. Certainly when the need for denial is critical, any excuse will do, and the art of denial is to then stick to that excuse like glue. But that does not mean we are so unaware we are practicing denial that we are unable to recognize and admit the truth when that denial is no longer needed, which, with the human condition now explained, it no longer is. We all do actually know that to achieve the loving order in the world that Montague recognised, the cold, bleak and loveless, as Drummond described it, ruthlessly selfish, competitive, must reproduce your genes animal condition had to be overcome, and the only means by which that could be achieved was through the mother-infant nurturing of love situation, the love indoctrination process. As was emphasised in Chapter 5.4, the problem is that love indoctrination is an extremely difficult process to develop and maintain to the point where the fierce competition to reproduce your genes is contained and integration achieved. Only our ape ancestors managed to develop love indoctrination to the point where competition amongst males especially was contained and unconditional love and integration developed, something the fossil record is now confirming, as described in Chapter 5.5. Bonobos are well on their way, but all the other relatively developed or integrated or social mammals are still battling to develop love indoctrination to the point where it has overcome selfish competition amongst males to reproduce their genes. But they are trying to do so. They are trying to indoctrinate their infants with love to the degree their circumstances allow. Reports from anyone who has worked with the relatively developed or integrated or social mammals and who is not under the control of the thought police, the truth-denying mechanistic scientific constabulary, give accounts of the development of love through nurturing, such as this of the nurturing, loving behaviour of elephants. After years of research and scientific observation, it has been shown that elephants' social structure and familial bonds are similar, if not deeper, than the bonds developed among present, immensely psychologically upset human beings. There are deeply stirring accounts by such scientists as Joyce Poole, Cynthia Moss, and Dr. Dame Daphne Sheldrick of elephants weeping and expressing grief at the loss of their calves and other herd members. There are recorded behaviours of near spiritual proportion. Calves frequently die of heartbreak from the loss of their mothers and abuse by human beings. There are also great displays of affection and mutual respect rarely viewed in the social structure of humans. Joyce Poole, internationally known expert on elephants, states, "I have never seen wild calves disciplined. Protected, comforted, cooed over, reassured and rescued, yes, but punished, no. Elephants are raised in an incredibly positive and loving environment." Note that Poole's comment that elephant calves are never disciplined echoes Savage Rumbaugh's observation that bonobo infants can do no wrong. Revealingly, like elephant orphans, orphaned gorillas and bonobos just die. They see their mothers killed and they give up. Because, as stated above, they suffer heartbreak, their emotional desire for, their instinctive expectation of receiving, and their attachment to a loving, true, integrative, meaning compliant world is so great they literally cannot survive without it. In paragraph 452, a quote from Savage Rumbaugh was included that described the rapturous joy expressed by the bonobos Matata and her adopted son Kanzi at their loving reunion. And when the Friends of Bonobos charity designed their fundraising A Bonobo Mother's Love t-shirt to have a picture of a mother bonobo cradling her infant, they weren't anthropomorphizing or inappropriately humanizing bonobos, as those mechanistic thought police would argue. They were unwittingly conveying the simple truth. Bonobo mothers aren't merely giving infants training in how to manage integration into complex social systems. That is an absurd suggestion. They are giving them love. But, again, when the need for denial is desperate, any excuse will do. The truth is that in the relatively developed or integrated or social species of mammals, nurturing has moved beyond the primitive, pre-love indoctrination, must nourish and protect maternal situation to the must-love maternal situation. They are attempting to develop love indoctrination. Chapter 6.6 Dismissing maternal love as training to manage complex social situations still left the extraordinarily cooperative lives of bonobos and of our ape ancestors to somehow be explained. While both the dishonest social or Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis, SMIH, and the ecological dominant social competition, EDSC model, have been relied upon to dismiss the mother-infant bond as nothing more than a mother nourishing and protecting her offspring and training them in the art of managing complex social situations, a big problem remained: how to account for the remarkable cooperative behaviour of bonobos and the light they shed on our own unconditionally selfless moral instincts. So the question now is, what nurturing of love-denying explanation did human condition avoiding mechanistic scientists come up with to solve this problem? The answer is that mechanistic scientists initially tried to portray the competitive aggression and violence that can be found in all ape species, except bonobos, as evidence of what our ape ancestors were supposedly like. But when it was found that the peace-loving bonobos didn't fit this model, they attempted to ignore the anomaly they represented altogether, and even maintain that despite the evidence, bonobos were no different to the other competitive, aggressive primate species. And then, when these scientists could no longer ignore the extraordinary integration that is so apparent in bonobo society, they conceded that bonobos are cooperative, but found a way to explain how they became cooperative that did not invoke or credit in any way nurturing. At this point, it should be stated that just as our fear of the human condition and resulting denial of it has been so great that we, the upset human race, have hardly been aware that we're living in denial of it. Recall in Chapter 2.2 how resignation needed to be described to reconnect us to the real horror of the human condition. Our fear of the truth of the importance of nurturing in human development and resulting denial of it has also become so developed and entrenched in us that we are hardly aware that we are practicing it. It is almost instinctive in us now to avoid the significance of nurturing in human history, as though it's a rule we live by, but with only a subliminal awareness that we are abiding by it. In regard to the initial strategy stated above, of relating our aggressive behaviour to that of apes, as was explained in Chapter 2.9, ever since Darwin presented his idea of natural selection, humans have been misrepresenting it as a survival of the fittest process, using that misinterpretation to support the reverse of the truth lie that, just like other animals, we humans have competitive, selfish, and aggressive instincts that our intellect has to heroically control. Chimpanzees appeared to support this lie. They were obviously human-like, and so were used as a model for our ancestors, with anthropologists such as Raymond Dart and Robert Ardrey pointing to chimpanzees' intense and violent male competition, rape, infanticide, and intergroup warfare as indicative of the behavioural heritage of our ancestors. In 1953, Dart argued for the predatory transition from ape to man, while Ardrey was even more emphatic, saying in 1961, man had emerged from the anthropoid background for one reason only, because he was a killer. More recently, in 1999, a leading anthropologist and the author of Demonic Males, Richard Wrangham, put forward the so-called chimpanzee violence hypothesis, which claimed that selection has favoured a hunt-and-kill propensity in chimpanzees and humans, and that coalitional killing has a long history in the evolution of both species. Obviously, these theories were immensely popular because the idea that our instincts are wildly aggressive made our intellect's supposed role as mediator seem all the more heroic. While it all amounted to a reverse of the truth lie, because as explained in Chapter 2, our instincts are loving, while our intellect is the offending, divisive influence, it was nevertheless a very human condition relieving thesis. Incidentally, even though we do now have fossil evidence supporting the love indoctrination explanation for our moral instincts, without the living evidence that the bonobos provide, it would be very difficult to prove the nurturing of love explanation for our unconditionally loving moral nature. Thank goodness for bonobos. Yes, with their peaceful and gentle society, the bonobos exposed this initial strategy for the lie it was, but in doing so exposed themselves to the wrath of mechanistic science as an unbearably exposing and confronting reminder of our now immensely angry, egocentric and alienated, unloving and unloved lives. So, as stated, mechanistic science's strategy to deal with this problem was to simply ignore the anomaly that bonobos represented. Indeed, this strategy was so successful that the first in-depth study of bonobos, which only occurred in 1954, was ignored and forgotten by the scientific community because it dared to describe them as an extraordinarily sensitive, gentle creature far removed from the demoniacal, primitive force of the adult chimpanzee. In fact, it was this ongoing denial that led de Waal and the photographer Frans Lanting to title their 1997 collaboration Bonobo, the Forgotten Ape. This book, which acknowledged rather than ignored the extraordinary sensitivity of bonobos, was, not surprisingly, vilified. De Waal's bonobo research came under sustained attack from primatologists such as Craig Stanford, who argued that bonobos are not, in fact, extraordinarily gentle and cooperative, but competitive and aggressive like chimpanzees. Stanford wrote in a 1998 article in the journal Current Anthropology that it is clear that much of the research on these two intensively studied apes, in the case of bonobos, I would argue superficially studied, remains fraught with untested assumptions, and that reported differences have been inflated. Responding to Stanford's criticisms, de Waal insightfully wrote that two strategies have emerged to keep bonobos at a distance so as to preserve chimpanzee-based scenarios of human evolution, which traditionally emphasize warfare, hunting, tool use, and male dominance. The first strategy is to describe the bonobo as an interesting but specialized anomaly that can be safely ignored as a possible model of the last common ancestor. See Wrangham and Peterson, 1996. The second strategy adopted by Stanford is to minimize the differences between the two pan-species. If bonobos behave, by and large, like chimpanzees, there's no reason to question the latter species' prominence as a model. Another illustration of the use of this second strategy was provided in paragraph 208, when it was documented how E.O. Wilson attempted to suggest that bonobos and chimpanzees were indistinguishable because both do not share and both hunt in coordinated packs. However, as was demonstrated there, even the most basic research shows that Wilson had to fudge the evidence to support his lie. The problem that emerged with these dismissive strategies was that modern technology has increasingly made the bonobos more accessible, and their extraordinarily integrative behaviour that is so different to chimpanzees almost impossible to ignore. Bonobos, The French documentary that was referred to in paragraph 418 is a case in point. The fact is, with their extraordinarily loving behaviour, bonobos have represented an ever-growing thorn in the side of a mechanistic scientific fraternity that desperately wanted to avoid their significance. And since bonobos couldn't be ignored or misrepresented forever, something had to be done to at least minimise their confronting presence. What happened was that while their extraordinarily sensitive, gentle, peaceful, cooperative behaviour could not be credibly denied, and in any case there was, as will be explained shortly in chapter 6.9, a growing desire among ideal behaviour emphasising but human condition avoiding left-wing biologists to be able to emphasise cooperativeness and gentleness. It was hoped that at least a way could be found to explain why bonobos were cooperative in a manner that still avoided acknowledging the unbearable significance of their remarkable nurturing maternal behaviour. And the way that was found was through a theory known as the social ecological model that sought to explain social behaviour in terms of ecological factors that influence social interactions. Before describing the social ecological model, it should be documented how mechanistic science has dismissed the fossilised evidence of our species' cooperative past by employing a strategy of evasion almost identical to that which has been applied to the bonobos. Chapter 6.7 Fossil evidence of our species' cooperative past has also been dismissed, ignored, or misrepresented by mechanistic science. Yes, just as the evidence provided by bonobos of our species' cooperative past has been denied by mechanistic science, first by claiming that our ancestors behaved competitively and aggressively, like most ape species, and, when bonobos clearly didn't fit that model, by simply ignoring or misrepresenting their anomalous existence altogether. The fossilised evidence of our cooperative past has also been dismissed as irrelevant, and, when that strategy became untenable, it too was simply ignored, misrepresented, or accounted for in a dishonest, nurturing-avoiding way. For instance, it was stated in chapter 5.5 that the fossil record reveals that our ape ancestors had small canine teeth. Although it was explained there that the only accountable explanation for the reduction in canine size in our ape ancestors is that it was caused by female sexual selection against male mating aggression, that small canines are indicative of minimal social aggression. Mechanistic scientists initially tried to avoid the implications these small canines raised by maintaining that they were only a recent development and that the fossil record would inevitably produce evidence of an aggressive heritage. For example, in 1915, it was written that we should discover such a race, a human race in which the canine teeth were pointed, projecting, and shaped as in anthropoid apes, sooner or later, has been an article of faith in the anthropologist's creed ever since Darwin's time. However, as subsequent fossil discoveries pushed back, by millions of years, the age at which our ape ancestors still had small canines, it became increasingly difficult to maintain this article of faith of an aggressive human race. As noted in chapter 5.5, there have also been attempts to account for our ancestors' canine reduction that did not cite a reduction in aggression, but they have also been rendered untenable by these ongoing discoveries, such as by what we know now of their diet. So, through the recent discoveries of Ardipithecus auroran and the 7-million-year-old Sahelanthropus and the conclusive evidence they provide of our species' cooperative heritage, it appears that human condition avoiding mechanistic scientists have been cornered into simply ignoring this evidence. For example, Richard Wrangham published the chimpanzee violence hypothesis in 1999, and yet failed to mention the discovery, only 7 years earlier, of Ardipithecus, a find that had confirmed the existence of small canines at least 4.4 million years ago. Similarly, E.O. Wilson's attempt in his 2012 book, The Social Conquest of Earth, to portray war as a universal and eternal presence in human history, a claim that was repudiated in Chapter 2.11, makes no mention of the fact that small canines characterise our ape ancestors, despite Wilson discussing both Australopithecus and Ardipithecus in his book. In 2009, the popular science magazine Scientific American, a subsidiary of the leading journal Nature, failed to make a single reference to a suite of papers, which had been some 15 years in the making, on Ardipithecus ramidus, that had been published that year in a special edition of Science, the most extensive special issue of Science since Apollo 11. As Tim White, team leader of the Ardipithecus researchers, asked with justifiable perplexity, how and why did the Scientific American editorial miss that story? It is as if the fossil evidence of a cooperative past has become too strong to refute, but the implications too daunting to acknowledge, rendering the majority of mechanistic scientists speechless. While a handful of scientists have broken the silence since the Ardipithecus discoveries were published, predictably most have done so to deny their cooperative implications on the only grounds left, which is by arguing that Ardipithecus, Auroran and Sahelanthropus are not part of the human lineage, despite all the evidence indicating that they are. And even those who do recognise that these early hominids are part of the human lineage only do so by contriving implausible explanations to account for the characteristics that their fossils reveal, specifically those that were described in Chapter 5.5, small canines and bipedality. For example, C. Owen Lovejoy, the primary anthropologist on the Ardipithecus research team, and Tim White have put forward what is really an absurdly improbable explanation for the emergence of these traits in the form of the so-called male provisioning model. This model suggests that our ancestors adopted a monogamous social structure, where females selected for less aggressive males who would provide for them and their offspring in exchange for mating exclusivity, arguing that this selection for less aggressive males accounts for the reduced canines evident in our ancestors, and that their need to carry provisions led to the development of bipedalism. Even denial-compliant, nurturing-avoiding mechanistic scientists are able to point to the weaknesses of the model, with Wrangham, for example, writing that obstacles to the male provisioning model include scepticism that a male who left his mate to find food for her could guard her from rival males, the absence of any evidence for home bases, the matter of why females became bipedal, and evidence that Australopith life histories resemble those of apes, not of humans, as Lovejoy's scheme implied they should. In addition, no living non-human primates exhibit monogamy within social communities. I could add that in addition to the flaws Wrangham points out, the only monogamous primate in our species' direct lineage, the gibbon, has very large canines, while bonobos, the species of great ape that most closely resembles our ape ancestor, have the smallest canines and are the most bipedal, characteristics the male provisioning model is meant to explain, and yet they are polygamous. Yes, mechanistic science's strategy for dealing with the fossil record's evidence of a cooperative past has followed a pattern similar to that which was employed to deal with the bonobos. First, denounce the evidence as irrelevant on the false basis that our past is aggressive, and then, when that position becomes untenable, simply ignore the evidence, or, failing that, come up with a fanciful, nurturing-avoiding explanation for it. A further point of significance, and one that is raised above, as well as in paragraph 4.11, is that the fossil record, particularly the 1992 discovery of Ardipithecus, clearly shows the physical and behavioural similarities between our pre-Australopithecine ape ancestors and bonobos. But if bonobos themselves needed to be ignored, it follows that any evidence that links our ancestors to them will be treated the same way, as indeed it has. It should be no surprise that, as de Waal explains in his 2013 book, The Bonobo and the Atheist, a scientist on the Ardipithecus team, Owen Lovejoy, could think only of chimps as a comparison, and yet the bonobo's body proportions, its long legs and narrow shoulders, seem to perfectly fit the descriptions of Ardi, as do its relatively small canines. Why was the bonobo overlooked?